I recently received one of the Rio Grande SD40T-2 locomotives from Scale Train's latest run of tunnel motors. But before I show you the locomotive, I'd like to talk about the Rio Grande for just a little bit and just touch on the merger with Southern Pacific as well. If you're a fan of Western railroading, then you probably have some appreciation for the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande was actually a small regional railroad. Now, if you take a line on a map and draw from Pueblo up through Denver, drawing a straight line through Colorado, the Rio Grande just operated on the western side of Colorado, and then they had a line that ran into Salt Lake. Now, the trackage, including the narrow gauge lines, was only about 2,000 miles. Now, if I remove the narrow gauge track from the Rio Grande routes, you can see how limited the range was. You know, when people think about the California Zephyr, the famous passenger train, there's a lot of identification with it and the Rio Grande. But actually, the only part of the California Zephyr route that the Rio Grande operated was from Denver to Salt Lake City. The rest of the route was run by the Burlington route and Western Pacific. When we think of a Class 1 railroad like the Rio Grande, we think that they must have thousands of locomotives. But actually, the Rio Grande, from 1941 until 1990, only had a total of 609 diesel locomotives. Of that 609 locomotives, EMD Jeeps, the GP7, GP9, GP30, GP35, GP40, GP40-2, and GP60 accounted for 194. Now, 6-axle EMD locomotives, SD7, SD9, SD45, SD40T-2, SD50 accounted for 131 locomotives. With the exception of 3 Krauss-Maffei ML4000 locomotives purchased in 1961, all Rio Grande diesel locomotives after 1950 were EMDs. So the remaining 284 locomotives that Rio Grande owned over its entire history were F units and switchers. The most numerous diesel locomotive that the Rio Grande owned in its entire history is the SD40T-2, and they had 73 units. The next most numerous diesel locomotive that the Rio Grande owned over its entire history was the GP40, and they had 66 GP40s. At the time of the Rio Grande and Southern Pacific merger, Southern Pacific was the 5th largest railroad in the United States. SP had approximately 17,500 miles of track and approximately 2,200 locomotives. At that time, Rio Grande had less than 2,000 miles of track and 196 locomotives. And you have to wonder, how does something like that even happen? Well, Philip Anschutz, who owned the Rio Grande, was a billionaire, still is a billionaire. And if you have enough money, you can do whatever you want. So Anschutz bought the Southern Pacific and merged it with the Rio Grande. With Philip Anschutz owning the Rio Grande, he viewed the Southern Pacific as the image for his company. The Southern Pacific was widely known, more so than the Rio Grande. And so Anschutz folded the Rio Grande and the Cotton Belt into the Southern Pacific, so that in 1992, the Rio Grande and the Cotton Belt no longer existed. The last new Rio Grande locomotive was GP60 3156. And 3156 was part of a 3-unit order: 3154, 3155, 3156. And these 3 GP60s were replacement for wrecked SD40T-2 5402, 5408, and GP40-2 3108 that were wrecked on the Tennessee Pass in 1989. But GP60 3156 was the very last new Rio Grande locomotive. All right, back round to the Rio Grande SD40T-2. There is some good news. 2 Rio Grande Tunnel Motors have been preserved. There's one, 5371, is at the Utah State Railroad Museum at Union Station in Ogden, Utah. The second tunnel motor that's been preserved is 5401. It was renumbered UP9871. Now it's been renumbered back to its original Rio Grande 5401. And it is at the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden, Colorado. I have 3 of the 4 most numerous locomotives that Rio Grande had. I have the SD40T-2. Rio Grande had 73 of those. I have the GP40. Rio Grande had 66 of those. And I have the SD45, and Rio Grande had 26 of those. Now, the third most numerous Rio Grande locomotive was the GP30, and Scale Trains makes a Rio Grande GP30, but I already have 2 Cotton Belt GP30s, so I'm going to pass on that. And being that my layout is primarily a Southern Pacific layout, I think these 3 locomotives are going to do me for the foreseeable future. I appreciate how Scale Trains engineered the rear trucks on these models, where the drive shaft isn't visible through the radiator intake area. And this is clearly visible when you have the models out on the layout, that this looks as it should. Southern Pacific got the first order of SD40T-2s in June and July of 1974. Rio Grande got the second order in October of 74. And Rio Grande got the third order in July and August of 1975. And this locomotive, 5358, was the third locomotive in the third order. Rio Grande 5358 was built in July of 1975, and it stayed in its Rio Grande paint until April of 1999. In April of 99, it was repainted into UP colors as 4046. Then it was renumbered as 8616 in May of 2000, and renumbered again to 2889 in March of 2007. On April 12, 2010, 2889 was one of 56 SD40T-2s that were retired by UP. We covered some of Rio Grande 5358's history, so now let's just appreciate the model without me talking. Time to get Rio Grande 5358 speed matched to the rest of my equipment. Now the scale trains models, for the most part, are pretty close out of the box, but I set the top speed of all my models down from 255 to about 150. So all of my models have to be adjusted and speed matched. My Southern Pacific SD38-2 is my standard for speed matching. All my locomotives are adjusted to it. And I always have it running backwards when speed matching, because whenever I put it in a consist, it's always put in backwards. So that's how I use it when speed matching other locomotives. Let's check out a couple of the features for the Rio Grande Tunnel Motor. There's the headlight. Bell. Love that horn. Class lights, white, green, red, off. Gyrolite. Go through the class lights again. White, green, red. All right, so let's fire it up. Well, let's fire up the SD45. Well, let's go for a test drive. I would like to get some more Rio Grande rolling stock and a caboose, but there just doesn't seem to be a lot out there right now. The part of my layout that's still in white plaster doesn't get a whole lot of screen time. I'm going to be making some changes to that half of the layout. They might be minor, they might be major, I haven't really decided yet. But there will be a lot of coverage on that part of the layout, in the coming months. Scale trains, Rio Grande SD40T-2. Scale trains did an amazing job with these models, and I'm really pleased to have them on my roster. So thanks for watching, and I hope you come back and join me again.